Number 1. Lucy Letby. Lucy Letby was not the kind of person anyone expected to see in a courtroom, let alone a maximum security prison. Colleagues once described her as quiet, gentle, and entirely unremarkable. The kind of neonatal nurse parents were relieved to see standing beside their child's incubator. She appeared soft-spoken, polite, and trustworthy. Yet behind that calm exterior, investigators would later uncover a pattern of medical emergencies so chilling that prosecutors compared her not to an overstressed nurse making fatal mistakes, but to a predator operating in plain sight. Born in 1990 and raised in a modest home in Hereford, England, Letby followed what looked like a predictable path. She graduated from the University of Chester and joined the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2012. Friends remembered her proudly posting photos of herself in scrubs, holding handmade cards from grateful families. She worked with premature and vulnerable newborns, the smallest and most defenseless patients in the entire hospital. On paper, she lived simply. She went out for meals with colleagues, spent evenings with her cat, and chatted cheerfully with parents at bedside. But between June 2015 and June 2016, staff on the neonatal ward began to notice something deeply unsettling. Infants who were previously stable were collapsing unexpectedly. Sudden drops in oxygen levels, inexplicable seizures, and fatal episodes began to occur. Almost always during night shifts, and almost always when one particular nurse was on duty. At first, doctors blamed equipment failures or underlying conditions common among premature babies. But the sheer frequency and strangeness of the events eventually became impossible to ignore. One senior doctor reportedly said,
"This is not bad luck. Something is very wrong."
Unexplained air bubbles were found in babies' bloodstreams, a medical signature normally seen only in catastrophic accidents. Some infants suffered sudden insulin spikes despite having no reason to receive the drug. Others showed signs of being overfed with milk to dangerous levels. Each incident was different enough to seem like coincidence, but similar in timing, location, and personnel. One consultant, convinced that someone was causing deliberate harm, warned hospital executives. His concerns, according to later reports, were initially dismissed. He was advised not to make accusations unless he had proof. That proof would soon begin to emerge. Medical records were reviewed, staffing patterns compared, and medication logs examined. A startling pattern came into focus. Letby was present at nearly every catastrophic incident. Even more disturbing was her behavior afterward. She sent sympathy messages to grieving parents. She attended funerals. Colleagues later recalled how she would stay on the ward long after her shift ended, even when she wasn't assigned to those patients. It was as if she needed to be near the aftermath. In July 2016, hospital leaders finally removed her from frontline duty, citing staffing adjustments, without disclosing the reason. She was moved to clerical work while a lengthy review took place. 2 years later, police raided her home. Inside, they found paperwork relating to deceased infants, handwritten notes, and, most hauntingly, a torn piece of paper with the words,
"I am evil, I did this,"
scribbled across it. Prosecutors would later argue that it was not a confession, but a moment of psychological conflict, a person wrestling with the enormity of what she had done. Her trial began in 2022 and lasted for months. Parents testified about the final moments they held their children. Doctors described how they struggled to understand why babies who had been improving suddenly deteriorated without warning. The defense insisted Letby was being used as a scapegoat for a failing hospital system. But the data told a different story. Out of thousands of nursing shifts, only when she was present did these clusters of collapses occur. No other staff member overlapped so consistently with disaster. In August 2023, the jury reached its verdict. Lucy Letby was convicted of 7 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. making her one of the most prolific child killers in modern British history. The judge imposed a whole life order, meaning she will never be released. She now resides in a high-security prison among some of the most dangerous inmates in the country. Her name is listed alongside Britain's most infamous criminals. To this day, some of the victims' families say the hardest part is the betrayal, that the person they trusted most in the room was the one they should have feared. And for investigators, one question still lingers. Was every case uncovered, or were there more incidents hidden behind statistics and silence? Number 2. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was supposed to be a comfort in people's final years, a calm, reassuring presence in the quiet hallways of long-term care homes. Instead, she became one of Canada's most unexpected serial offenders, not discovered by forensic breakthroughs or grand investigations, but by something almost unheard of in crime history, an unsolicited confession. She walked into a police station, sat down, and calmly admitted to ending lives. Not with rage or impulse, but through carefully administered injections that looked, on paper, like routine care. Born in 1967 in Ontario, Wettlaufer spent much of her life battling personal instability. Friends later described her as socially awkward, deeply religious, and prone to sudden emotional shifts. She struggled with depression and substance misuse while attending Bible retreats, journaling about sin and redemption. Yet despite her turmoil, she maintained steady employment as a registered nurse, beginning her career in the early 1990s. She bounced between care facilities across southwestern Ontario, often described by co-workers as unpredictable. Sometimes kind, sometimes cold, sometimes muttering to herself about dark impulses no one took seriously. Her patients were elderly residents, many with dementia or chronic illness, people who depended entirely on the staff around them. Wettlaufer worked night shifts when supervision was thin and questions were few. There, she began injecting insulin into residents who had no medical need for it. Insulin overdoses often mimic natural decline, confusion, coma, respiratory failure. In the controlled chaos of elder care, sudden deterioration was rarely questioned. Some residents passed away quietly in the night, while others survived but were left in severe distress. Her first admitted case occurred in 2007. Over the next 9 years, she repeated the same method again and again. 8 fatal injections, 6 attempted ones. Families assumed their loved ones had passed peacefully. She even comforted grieving relatives, standing beside coffins she had effectively filled. Unlike most serial offenders, there was no investigation, no suspicion, no pattern identified by authorities. The deaths blended into the normal rhythm of aging and illness. Her crimes lived in silence. What made Wettlaufer different from nearly every offender of her kind was what happened next. In 2016, she entered a rehabilitation program where, during a private conversation with a counselor, she blurted out her secret. She claimed she
felt a red surge,
a compulsion, a darkness she couldn't suppress. The counselor, stunned, reported it immediately. Police were skeptical at first. Without physical evidence, what could they do with a confession that sounded too extreme to be real? But when they cross-referenced her statements with medical records, something chilling emerged. The names she listed lined up precisely with residents who had died under her care. Batch after batch of death certificates began matching her admissions, down to dates and room numbers. Wettlaufer was arrested and interrogated. She didn't resist. She spoke plainly, almost casually, explaining how she stood beside each bed, pushed the syringe, and walked away. She said she believed she was
sending them to God.
Prosecutors later emphasized that none of her victims had requested help dying. There was no mercy in her acts, only power. Her trial in 2017 was swift. Rather than dragging families through months of proceedings, She entered a guilty plea to 8 counts of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. In Canadian law, that number of confirmed intentional killings is nearly unprecedented. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 25 years, one of the harshest penalties available in the country. Today, Elizabeth Wettlaufer resides in a federal prison, forbidden from ever working or volunteering in any caregiving role again. She has given occasional interviews, but her explanations remain vague, a mixture of guilt, ego, and distorted righteousness. For many Canadians, one question remains more unnerving than anything presented in court. How many others like her exist, hidden behind the quiet respectability of caregivers whose actions are disguised as natural deaths? Number 3. Genene Jones. Years before hospitals began installing cameras and digitized medication logs, there was a quiet epidemic unfolding in pediatric wards across Texas, one that would only be recognized in hindsight. Nurses whispered about code blue streaks whenever a particular colleague was on duty, but no one wanted to believe that a caregiver could be the cause. Genene Jones thrived in that uncertainty. She wasn't the soft-spoken type like most nurses in these stories. She was loud, commanding, and almost proud of how comfortable she was in chaos. In fact, she positioned herself as the one person who could stay calm when a baby's life hung in the balance. Looking back, that's what made her so dangerous. Born in 1950 and adopted into a stable family in Texas, Jones trained as a vocational nurse in the late 1970s. She developed a reputation early on as abrasive but oddly confident, a woman who seemed more interested in being recognized than being liked. When she joined the pediatric unit at Bexar County Hospital, colleagues noticed she was unusually eager to respond to emergencies. Some even said she seemed disappointed when things were quiet. That observation would take on new meaning years later. Soon after she began working, the unit experienced an alarming rise in sudden medical collapses among infants. Babies who had been recovering from routine ailments would suddenly go into respiratory distress or suffer unexplained seizures. At first, doctors blamed underlying conditions, but when crash cart alarms started sounding too often, some staff wondered aloud why it always seemed to happen around the same nurse. Jones had a habit of inserting herself into nearly every crisis. She administered drugs without clear orders, often insisting she
Knew what she was doing.
What authorities would later piece together was that she was intentionally inducing these emergencies. Investigators believe she injected infants with drugs like succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant used in anesthesia. In the wrong dose, it can paralyze breathing almost instantly. The effects mimic natural failure, especially in already fragile infants. She would then attempt to resuscitate them, earning praise for her quick action. If they died, she still appeared as the nurse who tried everything. Suspicion slowly grew, but proving medical homicide in the early 1980s was extraordinarily difficult. There were no digital records, and toxicology screens were limited. Instead of launching a full-scale investigation, the hospital quietly dismissed her, not reporting her, but simply passing the risk along. She found another pediatric role at a small clinic in Kerrville, Texas, where the pattern began again. When a healthy child named Chelsea McClellan died following an injection Jones administered, doctors finally pushed back. This time, forensic testing confirmed traces of muscle relaxant in the child's system. Investigators pulled records from previous infant deaths linked to Jones and realized the pattern was no coincidence. She was charged with murder and attempted murder. During her trial, prosecutors hinted that Chelsea may have been just one of dozens. A state investigator later estimated that Jones may have killed between 40 and 60 children across her rotations, making her one of the most prolific suspected offenders in U.S. medical history, even if most of those deaths were never formally charged. In 1984, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to 99 years. A separate attempted murder case added 60 more. However, Texas law at the time allowed mandatory early release based on good behavior, meaning Jones could walk free after just a few decades. As her release date approached, public outrage grew. Families of suspected victims protested, demanding that she never be allowed near a child again. Prosecutors scrambled to secure a new conviction before that could happen. In 2017, more than 30 years after her original sentence, she was retried for another infant death and given a life sentence, effectively ensuring she would die in prison. Now, in her 70s, she remains incarcerated, still maintaining her innocence. The most haunting part of her story isn't just what she did. It's how long she was allowed to do it. Some believe she craved recognition. Others believe she invented emergencies to play the hero. Either way, she exploited a time when trust was assumed and questioning a nurse was almost unthinkable. Number 4. Beverley Allitt. Some people seek attention through kindness. Beverley Allitt sought it through chaos. Known later in the British press as the Angel of Death, she walked the halls of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, wearing the same pale blue uniform as every other pediatric nurse. But her motives were terrifyingly different. She wasn't driven by sudden rage or calculated malice in the way many violent offenders are. Instead, investigators believe she was motivated by something even harder to grasp: a desperate need to be seen as a rescuer, even if it meant creating the very emergencies she would then pretend to solve. Born in 1968 in a small village in Lincolnshire, Allitt grew up relatively unremarkable. But those who knew her as a young adult noticed something unusual early on. She often appeared with bandages, casts, or injuries that doctors could never fully explain. Friends recalled how she would exaggerate illnesses to gain sympathy. Some medical professionals would later suggest she displayed traits of Munchausen syndrome, faking her own ailments. But once she became a nurse in 1991, that pattern appeared to shift from herself to others, a behavior now known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Assigned to the children's ward, she worked mostly with infants and toddlers recovering from respiratory infections or mild conditions. The ward was calm until she arrived. Within weeks, the unit saw a surge of unexplained cardiac arrests and sudden collapses. Babies who had been improving would suddenly stop breathing. Monitors would blare alarms. Staff would race to rooms only to find Allitt already there, either performing resuscitation or standing nearby, claiming she had just discovered the crisis. The medical team struggled to comprehend what was happening. One infant, Liam Taylor, suffered multiple unexplained breathing failures before dying. Another, Timothy Hardwick, collapsed suddenly and could not be revived. Soon, more followed. Some survived, but suffered permanent damage. Patterns began to emerge: insulin spikes in patients without diabetes, traces of potassium where it shouldn't be, injection marks with no recorded medication orders. But no one wanted to suspect a nurse. After all, she was often the first to respond, not the last to arrive. It wasn't until a particularly severe incident involving a 15-month-old girl named Katie Phillips, who suffered near-fatal collapses twice under Allitt's watch, that doctors began to suspect foul play. One consultant, unable to ignore the pattern any longer, insisted that an external review be launched. When authorities cross-referenced all serious incidents with staff rosters, one name appeared in nearly every case: Beverley Allitt. She was quietly removed from the ward while investigators gathered evidence. A full medical audit revealed toxic levels of insulin and other substances in multiple victims. Police searched her belongings and found a syringe hidden in her uniform pocket. Though no direct confession was ever made, the circumstantial evidence built an overwhelming picture. In 1993, Allitt was charged with 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder and 6 counts of grievous bodily harm. During the trial, she remained emotionless, offering no clear motive. Prosecutors argued that her actions aligned with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, someone who induces harm in order to display care. In other words, she didn't simply want to witness suffering. She wanted to be thanked for saving the very children she harmed. The court sentenced her to 13 concurrent life sentences with a minimum of 30 years. Due to her mental health diagnosis, she was moved to a high-security psychiatric facility rather than a standard prison. She remains there today, with her eventual release unlikely. Unlike many offenders who fit a predatory profile, Allitt's case deeply unsettled the public because her violence was intertwined with a twisted form of caretaking. She did not seek power through domination. She sought admiration through disaster. She was not just pretending to be a nurse, she was pretending to be a hero. Number 5. Judy Buenoano. Some killers act on impulse. Judy Buenoano preferred paperwork. Unlike many of the offenders in this lineup who operated in moments of crisis or delusion, she planned quietly, patiently, and with startling precision. To outsiders, she appeared calm and resilient, a nursing assistant, a mother, and later a military wife. But prosecutors would eventually call her something far darker, a financial predator disguised as a caregiver. The press had another name for her, the Black Widow. Born in Texas in 1943, Judy's early life was marked by hardship, but what stood out even as a teenager was her ability to maintain control. She relocated to Florida, worked various jobs in healthcare, and in 1961 gave birth to her first son, Michael. In the early 1970s, she met a man named James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant. He was healthy, disciplined, and financially stable, an ideal partner, at least from the outside. Just months after moving in with her, Goodyear fell mysteriously ill. Doctors believed it was an infection or unknown disease. Within days, he was dead. Judy collected on his life insurance policy and moved on. Not long after, her new boyfriend, a man named Bobby Joe Morris, suffered the exact same fate in Colorado. Sudden illness, rapid decline, death. Again, insurance payouts followed. No one connected the 2 deaths at the time. After all, these incidents were in different states, databases, and cross-jurisdiction tracking. Judy quietly returned to Florida with her son, Michael, in an era before digital. Then, tragedy struck again. Michael, now a young adult, suddenly became paralyzed from the waist down due to unexplained nerve damage. Doctors were puzzled. Judy insisted she would care for him, placing him in a heavy brace and wheelchair. One day in 1980, she took Michael canoeing. Witnesses later recalled seeing the canoe abruptly overturn. Michael, strapped into his device, sank instantly in the water. It was ruled an accident at first, but once again, Judy collected insurance money. That might have been the end of it, until she made one final mistake. In 1983, she began dating a new man, John Gentry. Shortly after taking out a life insurance policy on him, Gentry's car exploded in a parking lot. He miraculously survived, and when questioned by police, he mentioned that Judy had been giving him daily
vitamin capsules
that made him feel sick. Investigators seized the pills. They weren't vitamins. They contained arsenic. Authorities exhumed the bodies of Judy's previous partners and her son. All showed traces of arsenic poisoning. The accident, the illnesses, the sudden deaths, none were random. They were a system, a calculated financial strategy disguised as misfortune. Judy Buenoano was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. During the trial, she showed no visible emotion. Prosecutors portrayed her as someone who viewed people as assets, not partners, not loved ones, but investments. In 1984, she was convicted of killing her husband, her son, and attempting to kill her boyfriend with a car bomb. Additional charges for earlier deaths followed. In 1998, at the age of 54, Judy Buenoano was executed in Florida's electric chair, the first woman executed in the state since 1848. She offered no final apology, no confession, no reflection. Most killers in medical or caretaker roles hide behind the facade of compassion. Judy never bothered. She didn't want to be trusted. She wanted to be paid. Number 6. Vicki Dawn Jackson. In a small-town hospital, trust is automatic. The nurses aren't just medical staff. They're neighbors, classmates, church volunteers. Vicki Dawn Jackson fit that image perfectly. A certified nursing assistant in Nocona, Texas, she was known as quiet, attentive, and always calm during emergencies. For years, no one questioned her. But by the time suspicions finally formed, at least 10 patients were already gone. And investigators would later learn she had quietly confessed to even more. Born in 1966 and raised in Texas, Jackson lived an unremarkable life by most standards. She had children of her own, clocked in for her shifts like everyone else, and rarely drew attention to herself. In the late 1990s, she began working at Nocona General Hospital, a small facility where most patients knew staff by first name. The people she cared for were elderly or recovering from illness, vulnerable, but not expected to die without warning. Then, a strange pattern began. Patients who had been stable would suddenly decline overnight. Some stopped breathing without explanation. Others slipped into comas despite showing signs of improvement hours earlier. 1 or 2 unexpected deaths in a rural hospital might pass without alarm. But soon, there were far more. A supervising nurse eventually noticed something unusual in the charts. Many of the deaths took place during Jackson's shift. Not only that, but in several cases, the medication log showed that a specific drug, mivacurium, a powerful paralytic agent, had been accessed shortly before the collapse. Mivacurium is typically used in surgical settings to immobilize muscles during intubation. In an ordinary hospital room, given to someone without ventilation equipment, it can silently shut down breathing. No convulsions, no visible struggle, just a quiet fade. When medical staff first raised concerns, there was resistance. How could someone so ordinary be responsible for something so horrifying? But the numbers kept climbing, and administrators were forced to act. Jackson was quietly suspended pending investigation. Meanwhile, forensic teams exhumed multiple bodies. Laboratory tests revealed traces of muscle relaxants and sedatives in patients who had no reason to receive them. Confronted with the evidence, Jackson initially denied everything. But behind the scenes, she reportedly confessed to a fellow inmate after her arrest, claiming she
just wanted to help people pass peacefully.
Prosecutors rejected that explanation. Some victims had been ill, but others were recovering. One was scheduled to return home the following week. There was no mercy in deciding for them. In 2006, after a lengthy court process, Vicki Dawn Jackson was convicted of 10 counts of murder. She received 10 life sentences, 1 for each life taken. She remains incarcerated in Texas, with no possibility of release. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the number of victims, it was how long it took for anyone to notice. In places built on trust, danger often hides behind familiarity. And in Nocona General Hospital, that trust allowed one nurse to become the final voice her patients heard. Not by accident, but by deliberate choice. Number 7. Dorothea Puente. From the outside, Dorothea Puente looked like the kind of woman you'd trust without hesitation. Gray-haired, neatly dressed, soft-spoken, she called herself a caregiver, a helper of the downtrodden. Neighbors in Sacramento, California, knew her as the generous landlady who ran a boarding house for the elderly and disabled. She hosted Sunday dinners, donated to local charities, and greeted passers-by with a smile from her porch. But buried just feet beneath that porch was the truth, one shovel of dirt at a time. Born in 1929, Puente had a difficult childhood filled with abandonment, institutions, and instability. By adulthood, she had crafted a carefully constructed persona, the compassionate matron who always opened her doors to those with nowhere else to go. Social workers regularly referred vulnerable residents to her, recovering alcoholics, mentally ill drifters, lonely pensioners. She promised them shelter and dignity. Instead, she saw them as steady income streams. Once her tenants moved in, Puente handled everything: meals, medication, and most importantly, mail. She insisted on collecting their Social Security checks herself, assuring agencies that the boarders were well cared for. Some truly were. But others began disappearing. At first, no one questioned it. Many of her tenants had no family. Some were transient. When neighbors asked about those who vanished, Puente would say they had
moved on
or found
new opportunities.
But one tenant had someone looking for him. In 1988, a social worker reported 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya missing after losing contact. Police visited Puente's boarding house to investigate. She greeted them politely, offered tea, and claimed Montoya had simply taken off. Something about her calmness didn't sit right. Officers asked permission to search the property. Puente agreed. The search began in the backyard, a small garden with neatly planted flowers. Detectives noticed areas where the soil looked uneven. They dug. The first body surfaced within minutes. Puente stood silently as more investigators arrived. By the time the yard was cleared, 7 bodies had been unearthed, later identified as some of her missing tenants. Authorities believe she had been drugging victims with sedatives, suffocating them or letting them overdose, then wrapping them in sheets and burying them in shallow graves. Her motive was simple: money. Once a resident died, she continued cashing their benefit checks, sometimes forging signatures, sometimes writing letters in their name to maintain the illusion that they were still alive. When one journalist asked why she did it, she reportedly answered,
"They were too difficult to handle."
Puente tried to flee after the bodies were discovered, but was captured in Los Angeles within days. Her trial in 1993 focused on 3 confirmed murders due to evidentiary limits, though prosecutors argued she was responsible for many more. She showed little emotion throughout, maintaining that she had
never hurt anyone.
The jury didn't believe her. Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She died in prison in 2011 at the age of 82, still insisting she was innocent. Unlike many criminals in caregiving roles who acted out of compulsion or emotional instability, Puente's story was different. She weaponized kindness as camouflage. She didn't create emergencies. She created comfort, just long enough for people to let their guard down. Number 8, Kristen Gilbert. In every hospital, there are people who thrive in emergencies, professionals who stay composed when alarms sound, and others panic. Kristen Gilbert was one of them. At least, that's what her colleagues at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts believed at first. She seemed calm under pressure, poised during crises, almost heroic when she saved someone in full cardiac arrest. But over time, some staff started to notice something disturbing. Medical emergencies didn't just follow her. They appeared to orbit her. Born in 1967, Gilbert came from a stable family and excelled academically. She married young, had children, and took pride in her reputation as a reliable nurse. But beneath that polished image, prosecutors would later argue, was someone who craved recognition, not through steady work, but through dramatic moments. She allegedly sought admiration not by preventing harm, but by causing it, then stepping in as the savior. Gilbert worked night shifts at the VA hospital, where elderly and disabled veterans received long-term care. The ward was typically quiet after dark, but when she was on duty, that quiet turned volatile. Patients who had been stable for days would suddenly crash, their hearts racing uncontrollably, followed by respiratory collapse. Doctors were puzzled. Some suspected heart failure, others blamed medication interactions. But the frequency of code blues became impossible to ignore. Eventually, pharmacy staff noticed an unusual trend. Vials of epinephrine, a powerful stimulant used to restart the heart during emergencies, were disappearing at a rate no one could explain. Epinephrine, when given in the wrong dosage or to someone without cardiac need, can trigger the very crisis it's meant to treat. When investigators compared medication access records to shift schedules, one nurse appeared again and again, Kristen Gilbert. Colleagues recalled how she always seemed to be nearby before the alarm sounded. She would rush in, calling for crash carts and directing code teams with calm authority. Some nurses quietly joked she must be cursed, always witnessing tragedy. Others began to fear the truth. Maybe she wasn't witnessing it. Maybe she was scripting it. One incident finally sparked open suspicion. A respected veteran named Henry Houghton died suddenly after showing improvement. A fellow nurse whispered to a supervisor,
Watch Gilbert's patients. They don't come back.
An internal review was launched. When the hospital confronted Gilbert about discrepancies in her drug access logs, she abruptly resigned, a decision that immediately escalated the case to federal investigators. The FBI took over. Autopsies revealed alarming epinephrine levels in multiple deceased patients. Former colleagues testified that Gilbert sometimes joked casually about death or seemed energized after a code. Prosecutors argued that she wasn't killing out of mercy or anger. She was manufacturing crises for attention. During trial, one expert labeled it hero syndrome, a psychological drive to create danger in order to appear brave. In 2001, Kristen Gilbert was convicted of 4 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Rather than receiving the death penalty, she was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms plus 20 years with no possibility of parole. She remains in federal prison to this day. While many offenders in this series acted for financial gain or psychological delusion, Gilbert stands apart for one reason. She didn't seek silence, she sought spectacle. To her, every life she endangered wasn't just a victim, it was an audience. Number 9. Rose West. There are criminals who operate in shadows, and then there are those who commit their crimes in broad daylight, hiding behind the illusion of normality. Rose West belonged to the second kind. To neighbors on Cromwell Street in Gloucester, she appeared to be a mother of many, juggling household chaos with a stern but capable hand. She was known as strict, outspoken, sometimes abrasive, but never dangerous. Yet behind the closed doors of Number 25, she and her husband Fred West were running one of the most sinister households in British history. Born in 1953, Rose's early life was marked by instability and neglect. By her teens, she had already grown hardened, and when she met Fred West, an older man with a history of violence, the two quickly formed a partnership built on control rather than love. They married and moved into a modest terraced house where they raised children, took in lodgers, and projected the image of a working-class family doing their best. But inside, that house functioned less like a home and more like a private domain where Rose made the rules. Unlike many offenders in caretaker roles who hide behind polite manners, Rose had a temper that surfaced often. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting through thin walls, sudden bursts of anger followed by silence. Children in the home appeared withdrawn, rigid, almost fearful of breaking routine. Visitors later said they sensed something was wrong off, but no one imagined the scale of what was happening beneath their feet, literally. For years, young women connected to the family went missing. Some were lodgers, some were acquaintances, some were members of the household itself. Their disappearances were dismissed as runaways or personal disputes. Rose would brush off questions, sometimes with irritation, sometimes with cheerful dismissal. She seemed too confident, too unbothered to be hiding something so sinister. The truth didn't surface until 1992, when one of the West children disclosed claims of severe abuse to authorities. Social workers began digging into the family's past. Records showed an alarming number of missing individuals connected to the property. Police reopened investigations and obtained a warrant to search the grounds. What they found turned the quiet street into a national crime scene. Excavations beneath the garden and under the floorboards revealed human remains, multiple individuals buried at different times. Fred West was arrested, and Rose followed soon after. During questioning, Fred attempted to take most of the blame, insisting Rose had no role. But prosecutors quickly uncovered evidence that she had been far more than a passive partner. Several victims showed direct links to her actions and decisions. Witnesses testified to her controlling presence, her temper, and her ability to command the household without question. Investigators described her as emotionally colder than her husband, not impulsive, but calculated. Fred died by suicide before trial. That left Rose to face all charges alone. In 1995, she was convicted of 10 counts of murder, including crimes involving members of her own household. She received a whole life order, meaning she will never be released. She remains in prison, reportedly living quietly, rarely speaking of her past. Unlike others in this series who operated in hospitals or care homes, Rose West turned her own house into a place of control and fear. She didn't need medical tools to cause harm. She used routine, authority, and silence. To the outside world, she was a strict mother and hardworking wife. Inside her home, she was something else entirely. Number 10. Christine Falling. Some of the most unsettling stories begin not with a master manipulator or a calculated predator, but with someone people simply underestimated. Christine Falling wasn't glamorous, charming, or particularly cunning. She was a teenage babysitter in rural Florida, a quiet, unsophisticated girl who bounced from house to house, hired by parents who assumed she would be harmless. What they didn't know was that behind that quiet demeanor was a growing darkness no one had bothered to examine. And because of that, children kept dying, one after another, while authorities failed to see what was right in front of them. Born in 1963 into poverty and instability, Falling grew up with limited education and a reported history of emotional outbursts and erratic behavior. By age 17, she began offering babysitting services around town. To most families in the area, hiring Christine wasn't unusual. In rural communities, caretakers are often found through word of mouth, not background checks. At first, nothing seemed alarming, but then tragedy began to follow her. Within months of caring for various infants and toddlers, multiple children under her supervision suddenly died. Each case was ruled as sudden illness or crib death. Falling would tell the same story. The child just stopped breathing. No one questioned her. Authorities saw no signs of violence. There were no bruises, no obvious trauma. The idea that a babysitter, especially one so young and seemingly passive, could be responsible simply didn't occur to investigators. After several child deaths, Falling briefly found work as a nursing aide in a care facility. There, an elderly woman in her care also died unexpectedly. Yet again, Falling claimed she had no idea what happened. Despite the growing pattern, she was never held accountable. Instead, she continued moving between caregiving jobs, leaving a trail of unexplained deaths across multiple households. Eventually, one of the surviving family members demanded a deeper investigation. Authorities re-examined earlier cases and noticed a chilling common factor. Every victim had been left alone with Christine shortly before death. Medical experts proposed that suffocation through smothering could leave few visible signs, especially in infants. Toxicology testing in one case revealed traces consistent with poisoning. Confronted with mounting evidence, Falling finally broke. She admitted to killing several children, sometimes, according to her statements, because they were crying too much. In 1982, she was convicted of 3 counts of murder. Investigators believed the true number of victims may have been higher, but the lack of forensic evidence from earlier cases made prosecution difficult. She was sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms. Today, Christine Falling remains in prison, rarely spoken about in mainstream discussions of serial offenders, not because her crimes were minor, but because her case does not fit the sensational stereotypes people expect. She didn't use elaborate schemes. She didn't plan for financial gain. She simply acted when no one was watching and trusted that no one would suspect her. What makes her story so disturbing isn't just what she did, it's how easily she was believed at every turn. She was quiet. She was young. She was a babysitter. And that was enough for people to assume safety, even as danger was sitting right in their living room.